I always cringe a little bit when we get to this reading in the Old Testament because oftentimes lay readers don't know what to say or how to pronounce those people in those 8 different categories. Joe did a magnificent job, but I venture to say even if he hadn't, none of us would know the difference, probably. So I want to talk about this reading today from Exodus. And I think that one of the things that it tells us is that once in a while we can get shown the true light of God in what appear to be the strangest places in the world. Today in this reading, Moses sees a bush that burns but is not consumed. That's very strange in and of itself. So he decides he should investigate. And it's what he finds in this investigation that changes the course of the rest of Moses' life. That life-changing moment is the subject of this reading. There is an American-born artist called Abraham Ratner who lived in the 19th century. He was born in Poughkeepsie and lived both in New York and in Paris. And he was an expressionist artist who created a tapestry of this subject. In that tapestry, the fire-colored area does not have any leaves or trunk or the branches of a usual bush. What is there are hands, presumably hands of God, suggested in about a dozen different line segments and red lightning bolts. One of the most interesting moments in the design is the place where the figures on earth, that is Moses and the angel standing behind Moses, touch the figure in the fire. This touch is accomplished when the left hand of Moses very gingerly reaches up and barely grasps hold of one of the lightning bolts that appears to be an expression of God's heavenly hand. The key word here is gingerly. Moses has not reached out to heartily grasp the hand or the lightning or the fire of God, whichever we perceive it as. His thumb and middle finger are hovering over the end of the lightning bolt, just about to close the tiniest bit and take hold. Perhaps Moses understands that reaching out to hold God's hand is like having a tiger by the tail or like sticking your finger in a socket. Moses wants to understand what he's seeing in front of him. I think what Moses and we need to remember here is that God isn't requiring Moses to go it all alone. God's purpose isn't to zap some sort of power into Moses. Instead, God offers Moses the power that is needed to do the task before him. Not necessarily a volume of power, such as in a gallon or a quart or any other measurable amount, but the power is simply God's presence in whatever measure necessary. God's words are, "I will be with you." That's what God says to Moses. Moses is probably right to be a little bit hesitant to take hold of this lightning bolt of God's power. But the God who will lead Moses' people to freedom is not the sort of teddy bear best friend kind of God. It's instead that we can remember that God's power is promised to us as well as we walk through this life, as we walk through our own journeys, as we walk through whatever we perceive our call to be. I will be with you, God says. God offers us the power of that little word, with. Moses' call was really an impossible burden for him, fraught with many ambiguities. And when God called him, Moses responded, "Here am I." But immediately afterwards, he said, "Who am I?" God assured him that the people would listen, but Moses still worried. He said, "They won't listen. Who shall I tell them you are? What shall I tell them they are to do?" So Moses was full of ambivalence, inhibitions, and his own fears and doubts. And I believe rightly so, and I also believe that Moses is very emblematic of us at times. So this God, whose revelation must be narrowed into what can actually be said about him, no one in their right mind would think themselves worthy of the task to speak the unspeakable, to name the unnameable. The presumptuous, the audacity of Moses to think that he could do such, or to any of us really, that we could do such. God orders Moses to remove his sandals and stand on holy ground. And so Moses instinctively hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. He was afraid to address whatever it was that he saw in front of him. Nevertheless, God insists, I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. And when Moses doubted his deepest self, God assured him, I will be with you. Such, I believe, is also the paradox of our own calls, the burden of our own calls. It is laid upon those reluctant among us, who often sit stammering in awe and stammering to try to bring the voice of heaven to earth. Moses was sitting there just minding his own business, literally taking care of his father-in-law's sheep, maybe dreaming of a better future for himself or his family, and occasionally perhaps wondering what was going on with his friends and family back in Egypt, a people and a place that he believed needed him. The order to remove his shoes because the very ground on which he was standing was holy. Just plain, dusty soil on a mountain, dotted with a few scruffy bushes and perhaps a few sheep droppings. It reminds me of the sheep droppings that must have been around the holy ground of the manger where Jesus was laid over 1,000 years later, but still holy. Once in a while, we are shown the true light in the strangest and most ordinary of places. And this recognition that even such an ordinary place could be holy sent Moses back to the other holy ground, that place of suffering in Egypt. God can and does designate any place before us and any place in the world as holy ground, the place where sacred encounters can take place anywhere God is. This past week, we've all seen pictures of the carnage at the mosque in New Zealand. So many times we've seen relentless destruction from natural disasters like floodwaters, just like the ones that have left tens of thousands in our Midwest states homeless and without food or water. And we've all watched open-mouthed and teary-eyed as people risked their own lives for the safety of other people. Several areas in this country are the worst hit. Major flooding is currently underway in parts of 7 states in this country. I heard on Friday's national news that NOAA, not the biblical Noah, NOAA weather, and FEMA anticipate that 200 million residents will be affected this spring in 25 states. Every dollar that we donate, every prayer that we raise for those people, and every conversation in which we honor these survivors, all of these recognize that God is present with the suffering, and indeed that God suffers alongside them as well. Because the ground over which 50 people died last week in New Zealand, or the ground over which 50 inches of rain fall and destroy lives and homes, that ground is holy too. It's holy because of the suffering of the people that exist there. It's holy because God is there, moving all towards a new normalcy. Each time the lectionary offers this pivotal text from Exodus, rather than words popping into mind, I often see the old movie, The 10 Commandments, that my grandmother forced me to see when I was 5 years old. I will admit back then that I was in awe of this huge voice coming from, I think, who's the guy? Charlton Heston. And so I asked myself, is that really the way that was? I admit to finding the movie a little bit more hokey, I think, than heroic, and the special effects sort of pale by comparison to those that we see oftentimes now. And I suspect that fewer and fewer people over the last 50 years or so even have heard many of the parts of the stories of the Bible. But hearing this reading from Exodus begs this question for me. What was the event really like for Moses? I am left with Charlton Heston as this big-chested, grand-haired Moses guy who was encountering this bush. But I think that perhaps is not the reality. I think this real reading from Exodus simply goes not in that direction at all. It actually focuses on a thoroughly reluctant Moses, reluctant to do what the burning bush asked him to do. And it focuses on Yahweh. That word doesn't appear in this reading, but the original Hebrew Old Testament gave the name YHWH in all capitals for God. Roughly, it's pronounced Yahweh. That's the person to whom the Hebrew people referred as God. But this God is also reluctant, but reluctant for a different reason. Reluctant to disclose his name, or her name, if you prefer that. The Bible's real Moses employs 5 increasingly lame excuses why he, of all people, should not be chosen to go back to Egypt to bring about the release of the slaves there. He questions himself, his God, his lack of special tricks with which to fight the trick-filled Egyptian people, his supposed poor ability to speak eloquently, and finally, and most truthfully, he asked God to choose someone else, something he apparently has thought from the very minute the bush started talking to him. This is no grand-haired man of power, but a meek little person conscious of his own futility and own inability to carry out a task. I imagine that he should be played perhaps not by Charlton Heston, but by someone like Woody Allen. This is the first time that I've preached from this text, so I focus more not on Moses as I read it and as I think about it, but I focus on the figure of Moses as a model for my own initial unwillingness to perform the work of my God, however much I claim and still claim to want to do it. And Moses' excuses too easily match my own. My self-questioning, my inability to act for a God whom I know I will never be able to fully understand or predict, even though I am duty-bound to continue the quest to understand. My often poor skills, my limited abilities, and at last my general feeling that at times my ability to effectively do this work seems so elusive that God will surely go somewhere else to find someone else to do it for me. But today I want to look a little more closely at the God who is calling from this bush, and especially these 2 memorable verses in Exodus 13, 14, and 15, where Moses demands from the talking bush a name. He says, "If I come to the children of Israel and say to them, 'The God of your ancestors has sent me to you,' and if they say to me, 'What is God's name?' what will I say to them?" It seems a very reasonable question, a straightforward request for someone who has never stood on the same ground as his God. But if anything can be said about God's reply, it's not at all straightforward. It really is not a reply at all. Instead, it is a refusal to reply. It is often said that the Hebrew word YHWH, Yahweh, is simply to be. That's the translation most often given. How is it an answer to Moses' question when Moses says, "Who shall I tell them I am speaking to?" And God says, "To be," or "I am." Not a full self-disclosure at all. There really is no content in such a name, and yet it may be all that Moses or that we may ever get. I compare it to a divine dodge on the part of God. And so it is there at the bush where Moses stands. God's so-called revelation of God's self is not a revelation in any sense of the word. It is simply a revelation that God's name may not be known, and Moses and we must simply learn to live with that. The actual name of God may not have any more than we can claim to speak certain truths about how God acts, but that is the beauty of the mystery that is God. So in reality, the God we end up with is a completely free God, free of my calculation or your calculation, free of us making God small, free of our own limited understanding. But that is the God that I need, in any case, to be the divine inspiration for my call. And I would suggest to each of you, it's the same God who inspires each of your calls, the same God that asks you to keep your eyes open for the strangest of places where you can be inspired to follow your own path and your own divinely inspired vision. Once in a while, we get shown the light in the strangest and most unusual and ordinary of places. It is there where we discern to what holy ground is God sending me now. Let us stand and affirm our faith in the words of the Nicene Creed.